The stranger rode into Chloride, New Mexico territory, on a Tuesday morning in September of 1878, his horse near collapse, his own body swaying in the saddle from what looked like 3 days without proper rest. Natalie Vernon watched from behind the counter of her small dining establishment, a modest wooden structure at the edge of the dusty Main Street, as the man barely made it to the hitching post before sliding from his mount and crumpling to the ground. She was through the door before conscious thought caught up with her actions, her skirts gathered in one hand as she ran across the hard, packed earth. The man was breathing, but clearly in a bad way, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, his clothes caked with trail dust that spoke of hard miles covered without adequate supplies. 2 other travelers who had been resting their horses nearby came over to help, and together they managed to get the stranger into the shade of Natalie's covered porch. "Bring him inside," she said, pushing open the door wider. "Lay him on the bench there by the window." The travelers, a father and son heading west to California, did as she asked. Natalie hurried to the back where she kept her water barrel, dipping out a cupful and bringing it to the unconscious man. She wet his lips first, then let small amounts trickle into his mouth. He coughed, sputtered, and his eyes opened briefly before closing again. "Madam, we would have helped him ourselves, but we have not got much to spare," the older traveler said, his face lined with exhaustion and worry. His clothes were threadbare, his son's even worse. "We are grateful you took him in. We should be moving on now." Natalie looked at them both, really looked, and saw the hollow cheeks, the way they held themselves with the careful stillness of people conserving every bit of energy. "When did you last eat?" she asked. "Yesterday morning," the father said, straightening his shoulders as if to deny the evidence of his own body. "We will be fine until we reach the next town." "That is 2 days from here if you are lucky," Natalie said. She stood, smoothing her hands on her apron. "Sit down, both of you. I have stew on the stove and bread from this morning." "Madam, we cannot pay," the father said, his voice tight with shame. "Did I ask you to?" Natalie replied, already moving toward the kitchen. "Sit." They sat, and she brought them bowls of rich beef stew, thick slices of bread with butter, and cool water from her well. The stranger on the bench stirred again, and she tended to him next, getting more water into him and wiping his face with a damp cloth. By the time the father and son had eaten their fill, and she had sent them off with a wrapped parcel of food for their journey, the stranger was sitting up, coherent enough to thank her. "I will work to pay you back," he said, his voice hoarse. "Soon as I can stand steady." "You rest first," she told him. "Then we will talk about payment." What Natalie did not know was that she was being watched. From his position on the ridge above town, Elijah Vaughn had been glassing the area with his field telescope, checking on Chloride as he did every few weeks when he came down from the mountains. The massive man, his long dark hair tied back with a leather cord, his arms thick with muscle from years of swinging axes and hauling traps, had witnessed the entire scene. He watched the woman with the chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, watched her feed strangers without hesitation, watched her give away food she had likely spent hours preparing. This was not the first time he had seen such generosity from her. Over the past year, since he had started occasionally supplying her establishment with game meat from his hunts, he had noticed a pattern. Natalie Vernon fed people. She fed anyone who came to her door looking hungry, whether they could pay or not. Elijah had never married, never settled, had spent the better part of his 32 years in the mountains and wild places, trapping beaver and hunting elk, living a life that suited his solitary nature. He came to Chloride only to sell pelts and buy supplies, and he dealt primarily with Natalie, because she always gave him a fair price for his meat and never tried to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She was efficient, polite, and minded her own business, which he appreciated. But watching her give away food she needed to sell, watching her care for strangers who could offer nothing in return, stirred something in his chest that he had not felt before. It was not quite anger at the injustice of her generosity going unrewarded, not quite admiration for her character, but something that combined both with a protective instinct he usually reserved for wounded animals he came across in the wilderness. He lowered his telescope, his jaw set. If Natalie Vernon was going to feed every hungry soul who passed through Chloride, then he would make damn sure she had the supplies to do it. He turned his horse back toward the high country, already planning his next hunt. 3 days later, Natalie was sweeping the front step of her establishment when Elijah rode up with a pack mule in tow. The mule was laden with more meat than she could use in a month, all of it carefully dressed and wrapped in burlap, along with 2 large sacks of something she could not immediately identify. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, surprise evident in her voice. He usually came to her back door, not the front, and never with this much at once. "That is far too much. I cannot afford to buy all of that." Elijah dismounted in one smooth motion despite his size, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. Up close, he was even more imposing than from a distance, standing well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His face was weathered from sun and wind, his eyes a startling light blue against his tanned skin. He wore buckskin pants and a dark shirt that strained across his chest and arms, and when he reached up to untie the first bundle from the mule, the muscles in his forearms stood out like corded rope. "Not selling it," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "Trading it for meals." "That is still too much," Natalie protested. "Even if you ate here every day for the next 3 months, that would not cover half of this." "Not for me," Elijah said, setting the first bundle down on her porch with careful precision. "For them, the travelers you feed. The ones with no money." He untied another bundle, his movements economical and practiced. "This is elk. This is venison. The sacks are wild turkey I smoked yesterday. You cook it, they eat it, everybody is happy." Natalie stared at him, her broom forgotten in her hands. "You saw me give food to those men the other day." "I did. And you brought me all of this because of that." Elijah paused in his work, turning to look at her directly. His eyes were intense, unwavering. "You cannot keep giving away your own supplies and expect to make it through winter. This way you can feed whoever needs feeding without going hungry yourself." "I do not go hungry," she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "You do," he said simply. "I have seen you give away your last loaf of bread and eat nothing but broth. Do not argue. This is done." He finished unloading the mule, stacking everything neatly on her porch, then tipped his hat to her and prepared to mount up again. "Wait," Natalie said, finding her voice. "At least come inside and let me feed you properly. You have ridden a long way." Elijah hesitated, clearly unused to such invitations, then nodded once. "Appreciate it." Inside, Natalie's establishment was simple but immaculately clean. She had 6 tables, each with 4 chairs and a long counter near the back where she served food. The kitchen was separated by a half wall, allowing her to keep an eye on the dining area while she worked. The smell of baking bread filled the air, and a pot of something savory simmered on the cast iron stove. "Sit anywhere," she told him, already moving toward the kitchen. "I have fresh biscuits about to come out, and there is roasted chicken with vegetables." Elijah chose a table by the window, his back to the wall, a habit born from years of staying alert to danger. He watched as Natalie moved efficiently through her space, pulling hot biscuits from the oven, carving slices from a roasted bird, spooning up portions of carrots and potatoes that had been cooked with herbs he could smell from where he sat. She brought it all to him on a heavy ceramic plate, along with butter and a jar of honey. "Coffee or water?" she asked. "Coffee, if you have it." She returned with a steaming mug, then surprised him by sitting down across from him with her own cup of coffee. "I want to thank you properly," she said. "What you did, bringing all that meat, that is incredibly kind, but I need to understand why. You hardly know me." Elijah took a bite of biscuit, chewed, swallowed. The food was excellent, which did not surprise him. Everything he had ever eaten at her place had been good. "Your food is honest," he said finally. "You do not cut corners. You do not water down the soup or use meat that is going bad. People can taste the difference, even if they do not know that is what they are tasting. That does not explain why you care if I feed travelers." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug. His fingers were scarred from a lifetime of hard work, the nails blunt and clean. "My mother used to feed people," he said. "Back in Tennessee before the war. She would put out a plate for any man who came to the door, even when we barely had enough for ourselves. My father hated it, said she was wasting food on men too lazy to work, but she kept doing it anyway." "What happened to her?" Natalie asked softly. "Fever took her when I was 16. After that, my father sold the farm and drank himself to death within a year. I went west, been here ever since." He met her eyes. "I know what it costs to be generous when you have got little to give, and I know how it feels to watch someone do it without help. So I am helping." Natalie felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Your mother sounds like she was a good woman." "She was." He returned to his meal, clearly considering the conversation closed, but Natalie was not ready to let it end. "Where are you staying while you are in town?" she asked. "Wherever I can put down my bedroll, usually behind the livery stable." "That is no way to sleep, especially not after the kindness you have shown me. I have a room in the back, just a small one with a cot, but you are welcome to it." "Free of charge," she added quickly when she saw him start to protest. "Consider it part of the trade." Elijah studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Appreciate it. But only for a night or two. I need to get back to my traps before someone decides to help themselves." "Do you live far from here?" "About 15 miles into the mountains, near the headwaters of Chloride Creek. Good water, plenty of game, far enough from people that I do not have to worry about neighbors." "That sounds lonely," Natalie said before she could stop herself. "That is the point," Elijah replied, but there was no harshness in his voice, just statement of fact. They finished the meal in companionable silence, and Natalie showed him to the back room. It was small, as she had said, but clean and private, with a real bed instead of a cot, a washstand, and a window that looked out on the mountains. Elijah set his pack down and turned to thank her, but she had already bustled back to the front, the sound of her humming floating down the short hallway. He stood there for a moment, his hand on the door frame, listening to her work. The feeling in his chest from before had not gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. Over the next 2 days, Elijah found excuses to stay in town. He fixed a broken step on Natalie's porch, replaced a shutter that had been hanging crooked, and reinforced the door to her supply shed. She fed him breakfast, lunch, and dinner, refusing to let him go hungry despite his protests that he was eating into her profits. "After what you brought me, I could feed you for a year and still come out ahead," she said, waving away his concerns. He also watched her feed others. A Mexican family traveling north to find work in the mining camps. A young couple heading to Texas to start a new life. An old prospector down on his luck and looking more dead than alive. Natalie gave them all food, sometimes slipping extra portions into wrapped parcels for them to take on the road. She never asked for payment from those who clearly had none to give, and she never made them feel lesser for accepting her charity. The protective instinct in Elijah's chest grew teeth. He started making plans, calculating how much game he could bring down before the snow set in, how often he could make the trip to Chloride without neglecting his trap lines. He had spent 15 years living for himself alone, and the idea of tying himself to another person, to a place, to responsibilities beyond his own survival, should have felt like a noose tightening. Instead, it felt like something clicking into place. A piece of himself he had not known was missing, settling into its proper position. On the third morning, as he was preparing to head back to the mountains, Natalie came out with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I made extra biscuits and packed some of that smoked turkey you brought. You will need food for the ride back." Elijah took the bundle, his large hands dwarfing it. "You do not need to do that. You do not need to bring me half the game in the mountains, but you did." She smiled at him, and he noticed for the first time that she had a small dimple in her left cheek. "Accept the kindness, Mr. Vaughn." "Elijah," he said. "Just Elijah." "Then you should call me Natalie." He nodded, then surprised himself by saying, "I will be back in a week, maybe less. With more meat." "You do not have to do that. What you already brought will last a while. Winter is coming. You will need more than what I brought to feed everyone who comes through." He swung up into his saddle with easy grace despite his size. "Besides, I need to make sure you are using it to feed yourself too, not just every traveler on the road." Natalie felt her cheeks warm. "I feed myself plenty." "You better," Elijah said, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I will be checking." He rode out before she could formulate a response, his broad back straight in the saddle, his shoulders blocking out the morning sun. Natalie stood on the porch long after he disappeared from view, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating faster than it should. Elijah returned 5 days later with another mule loaded with meat, and this time he also brought fresh fish from the high mountain streams, already cleaned and packed in wet moss to keep them fresh. Natalie was serving the noon meal to a family of settlers when he arrived, and she nearly dropped the plate she was carrying when she looked up and saw him filling her doorway. "Elijah," she said, surprise and pleasure mingling in her voice. "You are back sooner than I expected." "Had a good hunt," he said simply. "Where do you want this?" Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Elijah would spend several days in the mountains, hunting and checking his traps, then return to Chloride with whatever he had harvested. He always brought it directly to Natalie, and he always stayed for a few days, helping with repairs around her building, chopping wood for her stove, doing the heavy work that was difficult for her to manage alone. The people of Chloride began to notice. The blacksmith mentioned to the general store owner that the mountain man seemed to have gone soft, spending more time in town than in his usual haunts. The general store owner told his wife, who told her friends, and soon the whole town was speculating about the growing attachment between the generous restaurant owner and the solitary mountain man. Natalie tried not to listen to the gossip, but it was impossible to avoid entirely. She found herself watching for Elijah's return, her heart lifting whenever she spotted his familiar figure riding down the main street. She started preparing his favorite meals, learning that he preferred simple food, hearty and well-seasoned but not fancy. She discovered he had a weakness for apple pie, and she made sure to have one ready whenever he came to town. For his part, Elijah found himself thinking about Natalie when he should have been focused on tracking elk or setting traps. He thought about the way she hummed while she worked, the efficiency of her movements in the kitchen, the genuine warmth in her smile when she greeted hungry travelers. He thought about the strength it took to be so generous in a world that rarely rewarded generosity, and he admired her for it more than he could easily express. One evening in late October, as the air turned crisp with the promise of coming winter, Elijah sat at his usual table while Natalie closed up for the night. The last customer, a cowboy passing through on his way to Texas, had left an hour ago, and now it was just the two of them in the warm interior, the stove radiating heat against the cool night air. "You have been more than generous with your time and your skills," Natalie said as she wiped down the last table, "but I have been wondering about something." "What is that?" Elijah asked, nursing his third cup of coffee. "Why do you keep coming back?" "You have brought me enough meat to last through winter twice over. You have fixed everything that could possibly need fixing. What keeps you returning to Chloride?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. Then he stood, his full height seeming to fill the small dining room, and walked over to where she stood. Up close, the difference in their sizes was stark. Natalie was of average height for a woman, but Elijah towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the lamplight. Yet she did not feel threatened. If anything, she felt safer than she had in years. "I think you know why," he said, his deep voice soft. "I want to hear you say it," Natalie replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I come back because of you," Elijah said. "Because when I am in the mountains, all I think about is getting back here to see you. Because the idea of you giving away food you need, of you working yourself to exhaustion taking care of everyone but yourself, drives me near crazy with worry. Because somewhere between watching you feed strangers and listening to you hum while you cook, I fell in love with you." Natalie's breath caught. "You love me." "I do." He reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and cupped her face in his scarred, work-roughened hand. "I am not good with words, and I am not the kind of man who knows how to court a woman properly. But I know what I feel, and I feel like I need to make sure you are taken care of for the rest of your life." "The rest of your life," Natalie whispered, "if you will have me." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, his touch surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "I know I am not much. I live rough, and I do not have fine things to offer you. But I can hunt, and I can build, and I can make sure you never want for anything. And I can love you the way you deserve to be loved, fierce and true and constant." Natalie reached up and covered his hand with her own. "I fell in love with you too," she said. "I think it started the first time you rode up with that loaded mule, determined to make sure I could keep feeding people without starving myself. No one has ever taken care of me like that." "Get used to it," Elijah said, "because I am not stopping." He lowered his head, moving slowly, and kissed her. It was tender and searching, a question and an answer all at once. Natalie rose on her toes, her arms winding around his neck, and kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Let me take care of you properly." "Yes," Natalie said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They married 3 weeks later in the small church in Chloride, with most of the town in attendance. The minister's wife played the organ, and Natalie wore a simple dress of deep blue that brought out the warmth in her eyes. Elijah stood at the front of the church in clean buckskins, and a new shirt Natalie had made for him, his hair neatly tied back, looking like he wanted to run for the mountains but standing firm because this was what Natalie wanted. The reception was held in Natalie's establishment, which had been decorated with wildflowers Elijah had gathered from the high meadows. There was more food than they needed, contributed by townspeople who had benefited from Natalie's generosity over the years. The Mexican family she had fed brought tamales, The prospector brought whiskey he swore was the finest in the territory, and the young couple heading to Texas had turned around when they heard about the wedding, bringing a beautiful quilt the wife had made. "You have touched a lot of lives," Elijah murmured to Natalie as they watched the celebration unfold around them. "All those people you fed," they remembered. "I just did what felt right," Natalie said, leaning into his side. "That is why they love you," he replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Same reason I do." After the wedding, they had to make decisions about their future. Elijah's cabin in the mountains was too small and too remote for Natalie to run her establishment from there, and she was not ready to give up feeding the travelers who passed through Chloride. At the same time, Elijah needed to maintain his trap lines and continue hunting to supply her with the meat that made her generosity possible. They worked out a compromise. Elijah would spend 3 or 4 days a week in the mountains, hunting and trapping, then return to Chloride for the remaining days, bringing whatever game he had harvested. In Chloride, he expanded Natalie's building, adding a proper living quarters for them upstairs and enlarging the kitchen so she could prepare more food at once. He also built a smokehouse in the back, allowing them to preserve more of the meat he brought in. Winter came hard that year, with snow piling up in the streets of Chloride and temperatures dropping well below freezing. But Natalie's establishment stayed warm and welcoming, and true to her nature, she continued to feed anyone who needed a meal. The difference now was that she had the supplies to do it, thanks to Elijah's hunting and the money they earned from customers who could pay. Elijah also made sure that Natalie ate well. He watched her like a hawk, making sure she sat down to proper meals and did not work herself to exhaustion. If he caught her giving away too much without eating herself, he would simply pick her up, carry her to a chair, and put a full plate in front of her. "Eat," he would say in his deep, no-nonsense voice. "You cannot take care of anyone if you do not take care of yourself first." It became a point of affectionate contention between them. Natalie would protest that she was fine, that others needed the food more, and Elijah would ignore her protests and make her eat anyway. Eventually, she stopped arguing and started taking better care of herself, if only because it made him happy. One evening in January, during a particularly fierce snowstorm, a family arrived at the door just before Natalie was about to close. The mother was nearly frozen, clutching a baby to her chest, while the father supported 2 small children who could barely stand. They had gotten lost in the storm, the father explained through chattering teeth, and their wagon had broken an axle 2 miles outside of town. Natalie brought them in immediately, settling them near the stove and wrapping them in every blanket she could find. Elijah, who had been upstairs working on a new bed frame, came down at the commotion and quickly assessed the situation. "I will go get their wagon," he said, already reaching for his heavy coat, "before the storm buries it." "You cannot go out in this," Natalie protested. "You will freeze." "I have been in worse," Elijah assured her. He kissed her forehead. "Keep them warm, I will be back soon." He was gone for 3 hours, and Natalie spent every minute of it worrying while she fed the family and tended to the baby, who was showing signs of frostbite on his tiny fingers. When Elijah finally returned, covered in snow and leading a horse pulling the repaired wagon, she nearly wept with relief. "You fixed it?" the father asked, staring at the wagon in disbelief. "Well enough to get it to the livery stable," Elijah said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "You will need a proper repair before you can travel again, but it will hold for now." "We cannot pay you," the man said, the same shame in his voice that Natalie had heard so many times before. "We have lost almost everything. We were heading to California to start over, but now I do not know if we will make it." "You will make it," Elijah said firmly. He went to the corner where he kept his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is enough for the wagon repair and supplies to get you to California. Take it." "I cannot accept that," the father said, though his eyes were wet with tears. "You can and you will," Elijah said, "because that is what my wife and I do. We help people who need help. Now take the money, get your wagon fixed, and make a good life out west. When you get settled, you can pay it forward by helping someone else who needs it." The family stayed with them for 3 days while they recovered from their ordeal and got the wagon properly repaired. During that time, Natalie and Elijah fed them, clothed them, and sent them on their way with enough supplies to reach California. The mother hugged Natalie so tight she could barely breathe, thanking her over and over, and the father shook Elijah's hand with the grip of a man making a solemn vow. "I will never forget this," he said. "Never, and I will pay it forward just like you said." After they left, Natalie turned to Elijah with tears in her eyes. "You gave them almost all of your winter earnings." "We have enough," Elijah said, pulling her into his arms. "We have more than enough. And they needed it more than we do." "You are a good man, Elijah Vaughn," Natalie said, her voice muffled against his chest. "The best man I have ever known." "I learned from the best woman," he replied, kissing the top of her head. Winter gave way to spring, and with the warmer weather came more travelers. The trail through Chloride saw increased traffic as people headed west seeking opportunity or east returning to homes they had left behind. Natalie's establishment became known throughout the territory as a place where you could get an honest meal for an honest price, and where no one would go hungry, even if they had no money. Word of their generosity spread, and sometimes people came specifically seeking them out, having heard from others about the woman who fed travelers and the mountain man who made sure she always had the supplies to do it. Some came to thank them, others to warn them about trouble on the roads, and still others to contribute what they could to the effort. A rancher whose son Natalie had fed during a hard winter showed up one day with a cow, insisting they take it for milk and eventually meat. A group of miners who had eaten at her establishment pooled their money and bought her a new stove, larger and more efficient than her old one. The sheriff started directing travelers who needed help straight to Natalie's door, knowing they would be taken care of. Through it all, Elijah continued his pattern of hunting in the mountains and returning to town with game. But now he found himself staying in Chloride more often, reluctant to leave Natalie for too long. He had spent so many years alone that he had forgotten what it felt like to miss someone, to want to be near them, to crave their company like he craved water after a long day in the sun. Natalie felt the same way. When Elijah was in the mountains, she found herself watching the trail, waiting for his return. When he was with her, she felt complete in a way she never had before. He was her partner in every sense of the word, supporting her desire to help others while making sure she did not sacrifice her own well-being in the process. One warm evening in May, they sat on the porch after closing, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Natalie's head rested on Elijah's shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them content in the comfortable silence they had developed. "I have been thinking," Natalie said eventually, "about expanding." "Expanding how?" Elijah asked. "There are so many people passing through and so many who need help. What if we could offer them more than just a meal? What if we had rooms where they could stay for a night or two, get properly rested before moving on?" Elijah was quiet for a moment, considering. "That would mean a lot more work for you." "Not if I had help. We could hire someone, maybe one of the young women in town who needs employment. And you have already made the building larger. It would not take much to add a second floor with rooms." "It would take a lot," Elijah corrected. "But it could be done. If that is what you want, I will build it." Natalie turned to look at him. "You would do that." "I would do anything for you," Elijah said simply. "You know that. Construction began in June." Elijah did most of the work himself, with occasional help from men in town who owed Natalie favors or simply wanted to contribute. He added a second floor to the building with 6 small but comfortable rooms, each with a bed, a washstand, and a window. He reinforced the entire structure, making it sturdy enough to withstand the fierce winds that sometimes tore through the valley. While Elijah built, Natalie prepared. She hired Sarah Miller, a young widow who had been struggling to support herself, to help with the cooking and cleaning. Sarah was grateful for the work and proved to be reliable and hardworking. Together, they made curtains for the new rooms, bought linens and blankets, and stocked supplies for the increased number of people they would be serving. The expansion opened in September, almost exactly a year after Elijah had first witnessed Natalie feeding hungry travelers. They called it the Waystation, a place for travelers to rest and recover before continuing their journeys. The rooms were inexpensive for those who could pay, and free for those who could not. The dining room continued to serve meals all day, and Natalie's policy of never turning away the hungry remained unchanged. The Waystation became more successful than either of them had anticipated. People came from all over, drawn by the reputation for fair dealing and genuine compassion. Some stayed a night, others a week, and a few stayed longer, helping with work around the place in exchange for room and board until they were ready to move on. Elijah found himself taking on more of a managerial role, organizing the work that needed doing and making sure everything ran smoothly. He still hunted regularly, but now he had others helping with the heavy tasks around the property. He hired a young man named James to help with the woodcutting and basic repairs, freeing up more of Elijah's time to hunt and to be with Natalie. One October evening, Natalie realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she dismissed it as stress from the busy season, but when she missed a second month and started feeling queasy in the mornings, she could no longer deny the possibility. She was carrying Elijah's child. She told him that night, after they had closed the Waystation and retreated to their private quarters. Elijah had been reading by lamplight, something he had taught himself to do better since marrying Natalie, who loved books. He looked up when she entered, immediately sensing something significant in her manner. "What is it?" he asked, setting the book aside. "I am with child," Natalie said, watching his face carefully for a moment. Elijah simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and swept her into his arms, holding her so gently she might have been made of glass. "You are sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. But yes, I am sure." Elijah pulled back just far enough to look into her eyes. "How do you feel? Are you well? Do you need anything?" Natalie laughed, touched by his immediate concern. "I am fine. Just a little queasy in the mornings, but the midwife says that is normal. You already saw the midwife." "I wanted to be certain before I told you." Elijah cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were falling. "We are going to have a child," he said, wonder evident in his voice. "A son or daughter. Are you happy?" Natalie asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Elijah replied. He kissed her, tender and reverent. "You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, a purpose, love, and now a family. I do not have words for what that means to me." "Then show me," Natalie whispered against his lips. And he did. As Natalie's pregnancy progressed, Elijah became even more protective than before. He insisted she reduce her hours in the kitchen, letting Sarah take on more of the cooking responsibilities. He personally carried anything heavier than a plate, glowering at anyone who suggested Natalie might be capable of doing it herself. He brought her anything she craved, no matter how strange the request, riding into the mountains to find wild berries in the middle of winter or sweet-talking the baker in the next town into parting with his last loaf of special bread. The people of Chloride and the travelers who passed through the Waystation took note of Elijah's devotion, and it became a thing of local legend. The fierce mountain man, who had once seemed more comfortable with wild animals than people, transformed into an anxiously attentive husband, anticipating Natalie's every need before she could voice it. Natalie found his hovering both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of porcelain," she told him more than once. "I know that," Elijah would reply, "but you are carrying the most precious thing in the world, and I am not taking any chances." Their child, a boy they named Ethan, was born in late May of 1880, during a warm spring morning that filled their quarters with golden light. The birth was attended by the midwife and Sarah, with Elijah pacing downstairs, wearing a path in the floorboards as he waited. When the midwife finally called him up and placed the tiny, squalling infant in his massive arms, Elijah looked down at his son with an expression of such profound love and awe that Natalie, exhausted as she was, felt tears spring to her eyes. "He is perfect," Elijah whispered, his rough fingers gently touching the baby's tiny hand. Ethan grasped his father's finger with surprising strength, and Elijah's face crumpled. "Natalie, he is perfect. He is ours," Natalie said, reaching up to touch Elijah's arm. "Our son." Elijah carefully lowered himself to sit on the edge of the bed, still cradling Ethan with infinite care. "I never thought I would have this," he said softly. "A wife, a child, a real family. I thought I was meant to live alone." "You were never meant to be alone," Natalie told him. "You were just waiting for the right people to build a life with." Fatherhood transformed Elijah in ways that surprised both of them. The man who had spent most of his adult life in solitude became wholly devoted to his small family. He reduced his time in the mountains even further, hiring another hunter to help supply the Waystation with game so he could be present for more of Ethan's early months. He learned to change the baby's cloths, to warm bottles of milk, to soothe Ethan when he cried in the night. His large, scarred hands, so accustomed to wielding axes and skinning knives, learned to be gentle with the tiny life entrusted to his care. He would sit for hours with Ethan cradled against his broad chest, telling the baby stories about the mountains and the animals that lived there, his deep voice a rumbling comfort. Natalie watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him. She had known Elijah was a good man, but seeing him as a father revealed depths of tenderness and patience she had only glimpsed before. He was strong when strength was needed, gentle when gentleness was called for, and utterly devoted to ensuring that both his wife and son were happy, healthy, and safe. The Waystation continued to thrive. Sarah had proven herself invaluable, and they hired another woman, Martha, to help with the increased workload. The rooms stayed consistently full, and the dining room served meals from dawn to dusk. Natalie and Elijah's policy of feeding the hungry regardless of their ability to pay remained unchanged, and their reputation for compassion spread even further. They received letters from people they had helped, travelers who had gone on to make successful lives for themselves in California, Oregon, Texas, and beyond. Many enclosed money, wanting to repay the kindness shown to them, and Natalie and Elijah used these contributions to help the next wave of travelers who needed assistance. The Mexican family they had fed that first winter returned one summer, now prosperous from work in the mines up north. They brought gifts for Ethan and money to repay what they had been given, along with tears of gratitude and promises to never forget the kindness shown to them. The young couple who had been heading to Texas came back too, with 2 children of their own now, wanting their kids to meet the people who had made their new life possible. "You changed our lives," the young husband told Elijah. "We wanted our children to know your names, to understand that good people exist in this world." These moments of connection, of seeing the ripples their generosity created, filled Natalie with a sense of purpose that went beyond just feeding people. They were building something bigger than themselves, a legacy of compassion that would outlive them both. When Ethan was 2 years old, Natalie discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news came with less surprise and more joy, both of them confident in their ability to expand their family. Their second child, a daughter they named Emma, was born in early spring of 1883. She had her mother's chestnut hair and her father's striking blue eyes, and from the moment Elijah held her, she had him completely wrapped around her tiny finger. "I have a daughter," Elijah said, his voice filled with wonder as he looked down at the sleeping infant. "I have a daughter, Natalie." "You do," Natalie confirmed, smiling at the awe in his voice. "And she is going to have you doing whatever she wants before she can even walk." "Probably," Elijah agreed, not sounding remotely bothered by the prospect. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The Waystation grew in reputation and success, allowing them to expand further. Elijah built additional rooms, a larger kitchen, and even a small barn for travelers who had horses or livestock that needed care. They hired more staff, creating employment for people in Chloride who needed work, and the Waystation became as much a part of the town's economy as the mines or the railroad. Through it all, Natalie and Elijah remained true to their original purpose. They fed the hungry, sheltered the weary, and helped those who had nothing. Their children grew up watching their parents extend compassion to strangers, learning by example what it meant to be generous and kind. Ethan, even at a young age, showed signs of his father's protective nature. He would bring his toys to travelers who had children, offering to share without being asked. Emma, equally tender-hearted, would sit with lonely travelers and chatter to them in her small voice, bringing smiles to faces that had been weary and sad. "They are growing up good," Elijah observed one evening as he and Natalie watched their children playing in the yard behind the Waystation. Ethan was teaching Emma how to stack rocks, patiently rebuilding her tower every time she knocked it down. "They are growing up like you," Natalie said, leaning into her husband's side. "Strong and kind and generous." "Like us," Elijah corrected. "They are growing up like both of us." The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges but also joy and growth. The Waystation weathered economic downturns, harsh winters, and the occasional difficult traveler, but it remained a constant source of help for those who needed it. Natalie and Elijah's relationship deepened with time, their love growing stronger through shared trials and triumphs. When Ethan was 8 and Emma was 6, a severe drought hit the territory. Crops failed, water sources dried up, and people began fleeing the area in search of better conditions. The Waystation saw an influx of desperate families, all of them hungry, thirsty, and at the end of their resources. Natalie and Elijah did not hesitate. They opened their doors wider, rationed their supplies carefully to make them last longer, and Elijah spent long hours hunting in the mountains, ranging farther than ever before to find game. The staff worked double shifts, and even Ethan and Emma helped where they could, carrying water and setting tables. It was during this crisis that the true measure of the legacy they had built became apparent. Former travelers who had been helped by the Waystation years before began arriving with supplies. The Mexican family came with wagons full of food purchased with their mining earnings. The couple from Texas sent money and canned goods. The rancher who had given them a cow years before arrived with 3 more cows and several pigs, insisting Natalie and Elijah take them. "You fed my boy when he was starving," the rancher said gruffly. "Now I am making sure you can feed others. That is how this works." The generosity they had shown over the years came back to them multiplied, and the Waystation not only survived the drought, but helped dozens of families survive it too. When the rains finally came and the crisis passed, Chloride held a celebration, and at the center of it were Natalie and Elijah Vaughn, the couple who had taught an entire community what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. As their children grew older, both Ethan and Emma expressed interest in continuing their parents' work. Ethan wanted to learn hunting and tracking from his father, while Emma showed a natural talent for cooking and a genuine love of feeding people. Natalie and Elijah taught them everything they knew, passing down not just skills but values, ensuring that the Waystation would continue even after they were gone. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Elijah surprised Natalie with a trip to the high country, arranging for Sarah and the other staff to watch the children and manage the Waystation for a few days. They rode up into the mountains, to the cabin where Elijah had lived alone before meeting Natalie, and spent 3 days in the peaceful wilderness together. "You ever miss this?" Natalie asked as they sat by a campfire on their last evening, the stars spread out above them in a brilliant canopy. "The solitude, the simple life." Elijah pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders. "Never," he said firmly. "This was not a life, Natalie, it was just existing. You gave me a life worth living. You, the children, the Waystation, all of it. I would not go back to the way things were before for anything." "I love you," Natalie said, turning to kiss him. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Elijah replied. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." They returned to Chloride refreshed and ready to continue their work. The Waystation kept growing, and by the time Ethan turned 16 and Emma 14, it had become one of the most well-known establishments in the territory. Travelers came from hundreds of miles away, knowing they would find fair treatment, good food, and compassion if they needed it. Elijah, now in his 40s, still hunted regularly, though he had trained Ethan to take over much of the physical work. His hair had started to gray at the temples, and his face bore more lines from weather and time, but he was still strong and vital, his love for his family and his purpose keeping him young at heart. Natalie had aged gracefully, her chestnut hair now streaked with silver, laugh lines around her eyes and mouth testament to years of joy. She still oversaw the kitchen, though she had long since trained others to handle most of the daily cooking. She spent more time now managing the business side of things and mentoring the young women they employed, teaching them not just skills but the philosophy behind their work. One autumn afternoon, a distinguished-looking man in a fine suit arrived at the Waystation. He introduced himself as Richard Hamilton, a writer for a newspaper back east, and explained that he was traveling through the West collecting stories of notable people and places. He had heard about the Waystation and wanted to write about Natalie and Elijah's work. At first, they were reluctant. Neither of them sought recognition or fame. But Mr. Hamilton was persistent, and eventually they agreed to be interviewed, though they insisted he also talk to the people who worked for them and the travelers who had been helped over the years. The article that resulted, published in several newspapers across the country, told the story of a woman who fed hungry travelers and a mountain man who made sure she never ran out of supplies. It described the Waystation as a beacon of hope in a harsh land, a place where compassion was practiced as a way of life. The article praised Natalie and Elijah's generosity and highlighted the ripple effects of their kindness, telling the stories of families whose lives had been changed by a simple meal given when it was needed most. The publication brought even more attention to the Waystation, but it also brought something else: inspiration. People in other towns began starting their own programs to feed the hungry. Churches organized meal services for the poor. Individuals began looking for ways to help travelers and those in need in their own communities. Natalie and Elijah's example spread far beyond Chloride, touching lives they would never meet. "We started something bigger than us," Natalie said one evening, reading letters that had arrived from people thanking them or asking for advice on starting similar efforts. "You started it," Elijah corrected. "I just made sure you had the supplies to keep doing it." "We started it together," Natalie said firmly. "Everything we have built, we built together." Elijah smiled, pulling her close. "Together," he agreed. "Always together." As Ethan approached adulthood, he began courting a young woman named Rebecca, the daughter of the town's doctor. She was intelligent, kind, and had a strong sense of social responsibility, making her a perfect match for the Vaughn family. When Ethan asked his father for permission to propose, Elijah gave his blessing without hesitation. "Just make sure you treat her the way I treat your mother," Elijah advised. "With respect, devotion, and absolute commitment. A good woman is a gift, son. Never forget that." "I will not," Ethan promised. "You and Mother taught me what real love looks like." Ethan and Rebecca married in the summer of 1891, in the same church where Natalie and Elijah had exchanged vows years before. The Waystation hosted the reception, and it felt like the entire territory showed up to celebrate. Natalie watched her son with his new bride and felt her heart swell with pride and joy. They had raised a good man, she and Elijah, a man who would carry on their values and pass them to the next generation. Emma, meanwhile, was developing into a formidable young woman in her own right. At 16, she had her mother's gift for cooking and her father's protective instincts. She had started organizing efforts to collect and distribute food to families struggling in the mining camps, and she had a particular passion for helping children. Natalie knew her daughter would do great things, would extend the reach of their compassion even further than they had managed. One quiet evening, when the Waystation was uncharacteristically empty of guests, and the staff had all gone home, Natalie and Elijah sat on the porch they had shared so many times over the years. Emma was reading inside, and Ethan was at home with Rebecca, leaving them alone with their thoughts and each other. "Do you remember the day you first rode up with that mule loaded with meat?" Natalie asked, her hand clasped in Elijah's much larger one. "I remember," Elijah said. "I remember thinking you were going to give away everything you had and end up with nothing. You made sure that never happened." "We made sure," Elijah corrected, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it. "You fed people because you could not stand to see them go hungry. I made sure you had the means to keep doing it. That is partnership." "It is love," Natalie said softly. "Everything we have done, everything we have built, it all came from love. My love for you, your love for me, our love for our children and for the people we help. Love is what makes all of it work." "You are right," Elijah agreed. He stood, pulling Natalie to her feet and into his arms. Even after all these years, she still fit perfectly against him, her head resting just over his heart. "You are always right." They stood there as the sun set behind the mountains. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful and lasting from simple acts of kindness. and who loved each other more with each passing day. The years continued to unfold, bringing more changes and more joy. Ethan and Rebecca had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and they moved into a house near the Waystation, helping to manage and expand the operation. Emma met and married a kind man named Daniel who worked as a teacher, and together they started a school that provided free education to children whose families could not afford tuition. The Waystation itself continued to grow and evolve. By the turn of the century, it had expanded to include a medical clinic where travelers could receive basic care, a workshop where Elijah and others taught skills like woodworking and leather working to young men seeking trades, and even a small library that Emma had organized. Through it all, at the heart of everything, was the original mission: to feed the hungry and help those in need. That simple purpose, born from Natalie's generous heart and sustained by Elijah's determination to support her, never changed even as everything around it evolved. Natalie and Elijah grew old together, their hair turning white, their movements slower, but their love and commitment as strong as ever. They began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the Waystation, trusting the next generation to carry on what they had started. But they never stopped being present, never stopped greeting travelers, never stopped embodying the values that had made the Waystation what it was. One spring morning, when Natalie was in her early 60s and Elijah was approaching 70, they walked hand in hand through the property that had been the center of their life together. The main building had been expanded so many times, it barely resembled the small establishment Natalie had once run alone. The grounds were well maintained, with gardens that provided fresh vegetables and herbs, a large barn housing animals donated by grateful travelers over the years, and paths that wound through shaded areas where people could sit and rest. "We did well," Elijah said, surveying it all with satisfaction. "Better than I ever imagined we could." "We did," Natalie agreed, "and it will continue long after we are gone. Ethan and Emma will see to that." "I am not planning on going anywhere for a long while yet," Elijah said, squeezing her hand. "I've got too much to live for." "Good," Natalie said, "because I am not ready to let you go either." They continued to work together for many more years, their partnership as strong in old age as it had been in their youth. The community they had built, the lives they had touched, the legacy they had created, all of it was testament to what 2 people could accomplish when they loved each other and dedicated themselves to helping others. Elijah passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Natalie at his side and his children and grandchildren in the house. The entire town of Chloride mourned, and travelers came from hundreds of miles away to pay their respects to the mountain man, who had dedicated his life to making sure no one went hungry. Natalie lived for 5 more years after Elijah's death, surrounded by family and the community they had built together. She spent her final years sharing stories with her grandchildren, teaching them about their grandfather and the values he had lived by. When she finally joined Elijah, passing quietly in the same room where they had shared so many years of marriage, the Waystation held a celebration of her life that lasted 3 days. The Waystation continued under the management of Ethan and Emma, then their children and their children's children. It remained true to its founding principles, always feeding the hungry, always helping those in need, always embodying the generous spirit of the woman who had given away her food to travelers, and the mountain man who had made sure her table was always full. In the main dining room, now much expanded from the original, hung a photograph taken on Natalie and Elijah's 50th wedding anniversary. In it, they stood together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling at the camera with eyes full of love and contentment. Beneath the photograph was a plaque that read, "Love is shown not just in words but in actions. Feed the hungry, help the weary, and give generously from whatever you have. This is the legacy of Natalie and Elijah Vaughn." And so their story lived on, not just in memories but in every meal served, every traveler helped, every act of compassion shown. They had started with a simple observation, a mountain man seeing a woman give her food to hungry travelers, and from that moment, they had built a love story that transformed not just their own lives but the lives of countless others. Their love had been fierce and true and constant, exactly as Elijah had promised it would be on the night he proposed. It had weathered every storm, overcome every obstacle, and grown stronger with each passing year. And in the end, it had created something that would outlive them both, a legacy of love and generosity that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. The Waystation stood as a monument to what was possible when two people found each other, loved each other completely, and dedicated themselves to making the world a better place. It was a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of partnership, and the enduring nature of true love. And every person who passed through its doors, who received a meal when they were hungry, shelter when they were weary, or help when they were desperate, became part of that legacy. They carried forward the values that Natalie and Elijah had lived by, spreading kindness and generosity wherever they went, creating ripples that spread ever outward, touching more lives than anyone could count. In the end, that was the true measure of their success. Not the size of the Waystation or the number of people they had helped, but the transformation they had inspired in others. By living their values so completely, by loving each other so wholly, they had shown what was possible when you led with your heart and backed your compassion with action. Their story became legend in the territory, passed down through generations, a reminder that one person's generosity combined with another's determination to support that generosity could change the world. Children grew up hearing about the woman who never turned away the hungry and the mountain man who made sure she always had food to give. Adults found inspiration in their example, motivation to be more generous, more compassionate, more willing to help those in need. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave this world, Natalie and Elijah were together still, their love eternal, their spirits intertwined, watching over the legacy they had created and taking joy in every life it touched. They had found each other against all odds, had built something beautiful from simple kindness, and had loved each other with a depth and devotion that most people only dreamed of achieving. Their table had always been full, not just with food but with love, with purpose, with meaning. And that table would never be empty, would continue to feed both body and soul for as long as the Waystation stood, a lasting testament to two people who had understood what truly mattered in life and had dedicated themselves to it completely. The mountain man had seen her giving her food to hungry travelers, and he had made sure her table was always full. But more than that, he had filled her heart, her life, and her days with love beyond measure. And she, in turn, had given him something he never thought he would have, a home, a family, a purpose greater than himself. Together, they had created something extraordinary from something simple. Together, they had shown that love, real love, was not just about feeling but about action, about showing up day after day, about supporting your partner's dreams and values, about building something bigger than either of you could create alone. And that was the greatest legacy of all, the true heart of their story. Two people finding each other, loving each other, and changing the world one meal, one act of kindness, one generous gesture at a time. It was a love story for the ages, set in the Wild West but timeless in its message, as relevant in any era as it was in theirs. The Waystation continued to stand, year after year, decade after decade, a beacon of hope in a sometimes harsh world, always ready to feed the hungry, always willing to help those in need, always embodying the love and generosity of its founders. And in that way, Natalie and Elijah Vaughn lived forever, their spirits present in every meal served, every traveler helped, every act of compassion shown. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their love eternal. And the world was better for their having been in it.